The document has been moving through group chats, comment sections, and Facebook shares for days now. People are calling it Nolan Wells' toxicology report. Screenshots of it have been posted, reposted, argued over, and quoted as fact by people who are absolutely convinced they finally have the missing piece of this case. Some viewers say it explains everything. Others say it proves a cover-up. A few say it proves the opposite, so that there was no cover-up at all. Almost none of them agree on what it actually says, and that on its own should tell you something. Because in a case that has been defined from day one by silence, by a family begging for information, by a state government that has released almost nothing, by a district attorney who has said publicly that she cannot talk, a single document promising real numbers, real findings, real answers was always going to spread like wildfire the moment it appeared. The only question that actually matters is the one almost nobody stopped to ask before hitting share. Is it real? We're going to answer that. But to understand why this document detonated the way it did, and why so many people were ready to believe it without blinking, you have to understand the weeks that came before it, and the fact that this is not even the first piece of fake evidence to attach itself to this case. This case has been starving for information since the moment it began, and that hunger has already been exploited once before.
Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a 2025 graduate of Ocean Springs High School, where he'd been a three-sport athlete in football, basketball, and baseball, and had also worked behind the camera for the school's student media program. He'd gone on to Southwest Mississippi Community College in Summit on a football scholarship, and by all accounts was days away from heading back to campus to start training for the upcoming season. Friends describe him as warm and easygoing, the kind of person who lit up a room. His friend Treston Shepard has described the group Nolan grew up with as tight-knit and racially and ethnically diverse, kids who had known each other since childhood and stayed close well past high school. On the 4th of July, Nolan joined that group for a boat trip to Horn Island, a remote barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Horn Island isn't the kind of place you casually wander into. It's federally protected, accessible only by private boat, and according to the National Park Service, it has no staff, no drinking water, no shelter, and no communication infrastructure of any kind. Every Independence Day, though, it becomes an unofficial gathering spot for people from the coast. This year, roughly 300 people showed up, many of them former classmates reuniting for the holiday, spread across dozens of anchored boats. According to GPS data later released by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the boat Nolan was on left a private dock on the mainland at 9:56 in the morning and reached the western tip of Horn Island at 11:14. For the next several hours, Nolan was seen on the island in photos and video that have since circulated widely, laughing with friends, an arm slung around their shoulders, looking every bit like an 18-year-old enjoying a holiday with people he'd known most of his life. According to friend Warren Hudson, who wasn't on the boat with Nolan that day but spoke with him, the group that made the trip numbered around 24 close friends, part of the much larger crowd anchored around the island. Then, sometime in the afternoon, witnesses have placed it around 3 o'clock. Nolan told the group he'd find another ride home. They left without him. The boat that had originally carried him to the island returned to the mainland at 5:44 that evening. Nolan wasn't on it. For the rest of that afternoon and evening, the timeline gets thin, and this is where a lot of the online speculation in this case has taken root. There's a video, recorded on the island on a phone and later circulated on social media, that appears to capture some kind of heated exchange over a phone, involving someone social media users have identified as Nolan. One friend who was present has since pushed back publicly, saying the audio actually involves a dispute he was part of, not Nolan. Investigators have said they're looking into the video as part of reconstructing that stretch of the afternoon. What actually happened between the moment Nolan told his friends he'd catch another ride and the moment his family reported him missing remains one of the most contested, least documented parts of this entire case. And, as you'll see, it's also become one of the most exploited by people spreading unverified claims online. One friend has said Nolan chose to stay behind on the island to talk to a young woman he'd met that day, though other friends in the group have cast doubt on that account, and it remains one of several competing, unverified explanations for why he separated from people he'd known his whole life. Investigators have not confirmed any single version of what happened in those final hours, which is itself part of why this stretch of the timeline has attracted so much online speculation. Separately, one of the boats in Nolan's friend group began taking on water that afternoon after a bilge pump failed. The people aboard placed a call to Sea-Tow, a boat assistance service, before canceling the request once another friend arrived by boat and helped drain the water so they could get back safely. That call would later become its own flashpoint, which we'll come back to. Just after 11 that night, Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, got the call every parent dreads, a friend telling her Nolan hadn't come home. She immediately reached out to another mother in the friend group to see if anyone had eyes on him. Between the families, they started comparing notes using location-sharing apps. One app showed his phone on land, in an area that didn't match where his social media location was pinging from. Someone eventually retrieved the phone itself from a house on the mainland. Nolan was not with it. By the next morning, July 5th, Christine was posting to social media, asking the public for help finding her son. Nolan's football coach saw the posts and reached out to his father, Elmore Wansley, offering his boat. Around 6 that morning, the two of them headed to Horn Island on their own to search. Elmore has said that on the way, he spotted what looked like a family camping on the island, a detail that has stuck with him since, because it meant Nolan wasn't necessarily alone out there, even if no one could account for him. By later that morning, it wasn't just family looking anymore. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department, the Harrison County Sheriff's Department, the United States Coast Guard, and the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources had all launched a coordinated search. Boats, aircraft, and searchers on foot, combing the island and surrounding water, continuing well past sunset. The United Cajun Navy, a volunteer disaster response organization, also joined the search after Christine Wansley reached out to them directly. On the morning of July 6th, at roughly 8:40, a National Park Service ranger found Nolan's body along the island's northwestern shoreline, not far from where he had last been seen 2 days earlier. Officials at the time said there was no indication of foul play. For a family that had just spent 2 agonizing days searching, the discovery didn't bring closure. It brought more questions. Elmore Wansley has publicly asked why, if Nolan disappeared on the afternoon of the 4th, his body didn't surface until the morning of the 6th. It's the kind of question that sounds simple and isn't. Currents, tides, water temperature, and exactly where and when someone entered the water can all affect when and where a body resurfaces. But for a grieving father, the gap between those 2 dates has never stopped gnawing at him. Before going further, it helps to understand why a death like Nolan's is so difficult to pin down in the first place, because it explains a lot about why this investigation has stretched on for weeks without a clear public conclusion. Horn Island sits roughly 10 miles offshore, exposed to open Gulf water, with currents that local officials and longtime boaters describe as notoriously rough and unpredictable. The Jackson County coroner has told reporters his office has handled numerous drowning cases tied to Mississippi's barrier islands over the years, and that bodies recovered from that kind of water don't always resurface where or when you'd expect, because of how tides, wind, and underwater currents move a body over 1, 2, or more days. That alone complicates any effort to reconstruct exactly where and when someone entered the water. Then there's the state of the body itself. Decomposition in warm Gulf water accelerates quickly, and by the time a body is recovered and undergoes even 1 autopsy, let alone 2, a forensic pathologist is working with steadily diminishing physical evidence. Bruising fades or becomes indistinguishable from decomposition. soft tissue changes in ways that can obscure or mimic injury. That's precisely the challenge Dr. Mitchell described in his independent autopsy report. An inability to say with confidence whether marks he did observe reflected something that happened before Nolan entered the water, during or after. On top of the physical challenges, there's the human one. Investigators have said they're working to reconstruct the final hours of Nolan's time on the island, using witness accounts, cell phone data, GPS logs from multiple boats, and video and photos shared informally on social media by people who had no idea, at the time, that any of it would become evidence. Piecing together a consistent timeline from dozens of individually recorded, informally shared phone videos and half-remembered conversations among a crowd of roughly 300 people is a fundamentally different, far messier task than working from a single, controlled crime scene. It's slow and it's imprecise, almost by definition, which is exactly the kind of gap a fabricated document can appear to fill overnight. Within days, the Wells family brought in civil rights attorney Ben Crump, who has represented families in some of the highest-profile police and civil rights cases in the country over the past decade. Crump's team announced they were launching an independent investigation, citing what they described as contradictions in the official account and a troubling lack of information coming from Mississippi authorities. Crump and the family have pointed to several specific concerns: the video of the apparent altercation on the island, unanswered questions about why Nolan separated from a group he'd known his whole life, and what they see as a slow, tight-lipped official response. Nolan's parents have said publicly that they simply can't accept that their son, someone who knew how to swim, who was in peak physical condition as an athlete about to start a football season, would have ended up dead in the water without something else going on. Elmore Wansley told Good Morning America he couldn't fathom why his son would have separated from the group at all. Local officials, for their part, have maintained that their process is standard, that death investigations of this kind are always presented to a grand jury before any findings go public in their jurisdiction, and that a thorough investigation simply takes time. Both explanations can produce the exact same result: silence. And silence, in a case that has already gone viral, doesn't stay empty for long. It gets filled, sometimes with real reporting, and sometimes with something else entirely. Before we get to the autopsies and the fake documents, it's worth being precise about what law enforcement itself has actually confirmed, because it's less than most people following this case realize. On July 6th, the same day Nolan's body was found, Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter told CNN that his detectives were interviewing people who had first-hand interactions with Nolan on the day he went missing, and that no foul play had been identified at that point. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind said his office specifically requested that the autopsy be handled by the state medical examiner's office rather than locally, because of the condition in which Nolan's body was found, and in order to definitively rule trauma or foul play in or out. In the 2 weeks that followed, Sheriff Ledbetter said his department had interviewed roughly 60 witnesses and confirmed the FBI was assisting with the digital side of the investigation, examining phones, location data, and the various videos and photos circulating from the island that day. The 3 friends who had been on the boat with Nolan were, according to the sheriff, interviewed in depth. District Attorney McElrath told Mississippi's Sun Herald that the case was a priority for her office, and that once the law enforcement investigation concluded, she would forward the findings to a grand jury to determine whether any charges were warranted, a statement she made weeks before the fake toxicology report ever existed, and one that's consistent with everything her office has said since. That's the actual, confirmed record from investigators, an active, FBI-assisted investigation, dozens of witnesses interviewed, and a firm commitment to let a grand jury, not a press release, make the next call. It's a slower, less satisfying process than a viral document promising instant answers. But it's also the only version of events anyone has actually verified. It's also worth noting how the racial tension in this case has been articulated by people directly involved. Crump has said the family has real concerns about receiving a fair investigation, given that their black son ended up dead after a trip involving a group made up mostly of white friends. Terence Keel, a professor of human biology and society at UCLA, put the question many people are asking in blunt terms: how did a young black man with a promising life ahead of him end up dead after a trip with peers who, in Keel's words, couldn't explain why he went missing in the first place? That question remains genuinely unanswered, not because officials have confirmed anything sinister, but because the investigation is still ongoing and its findings haven't been made public. One more detail matters here, directly. In Dr. Mitchell's own preliminary report from the family's independent autopsy, the one Crump read from on July 19th, Mitchell wrote plainly that the original toxicology results had not even been received at the time he wrote his findings. That's not a fringe claim or a leaked detail. That's the family's own hand-picked forensic pathologist, in his own official report, stating in writing, weeks before any fake document appeared online, that real toxicology results simply did not exist yet in any form he had access to. On July 10th, less than a week after Nolan's body was recovered, Christine and Elmore Wansley spoke publicly for the first time, sitting down with Michael Strahan on Good Morning America. What they described was a son who was, in Elmore's words, more of a quiet leader, someone who led by example and worked hard toward his goals. Christine remembered him as just this bright light, someone whose smile and energy were infectious. They also laid out, for the first time publicly, the specific detail that had convinced them something wasn't right. When they recovered Nolan's phone, they found his Snapchat accounts had been wiped clean, and that the location data on the device conflicted with both what they knew of their son's habits and what his friends had described about that day. Elmore said the family had always taught Nolan that if you go somewhere with a group, you stay with the group, which made his separation from his friends that afternoon feel completely out of character. That we cannot answer, Christine said, when asked why he might have split off on his own. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter responded publicly around the same time, confirming investigators were reviewing the disputed altercation video and had requested Nolan's phone for forensic extraction. Ledbetter said his department was working toward the same goal as the family, a statement that, notably, positioned investigators and the Wansleys as aligned in their objective, even as the family's public statements grew increasingly critical of how the investigation was being handled. Frustrated by the pace of official updates, the Wells family commissioned their own independent autopsy. Crump said the exam was necessary in part because of what he called a serious trust issue with Mississippi's investigation, and confirmed the family had Nolan's body flown from Mississippi to Washington, D.C., specifically so the exam could be performed by a pathologist with no ties to local law enforcement. The autopsy was funded by former NFL quarterback and civil rights activist Colin Kaepernick through the autopsy initiative run by his organization, Know Your Rights Camp, which has funded independent examinations in other cases where families have raised similar concerns about official investigations. The exam was performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist and the president of the National Medical Association, on July 10th, 4 days after Nolan's body was recovered. On July 19th, Crump held a press conference to share Mitchell's preliminary findings. The headline was frustrating for anyone hoping for clarity. Cause and manner of death were undetermined, pending further investigation. Mitchell's report noted there were no fractures and no deep tissue injuries identified, and no lacerations to the skin or fractures to the skull. But by the time Mitchell examined the body, it had already undergone the state's official autopsy, and significant limitations had piled up. Some internal structures, including parts of Nolan's neck, throat, and hyoid bone, had been retained by the Mississippi Medical Examiner's Office, a common practice in forensic pathology when further examination might be needed, but one that left Mitchell unable to directly examine the airway or lungs for signs of water, or the stomach for its contents. The level of decomposition by that point also made it difficult to determine whether there had been any bruising. Dr. Priya Banerjee, another board-certified forensic pathologist, later noted publicly that second autopsies carry an inherent limitation, because a body examined a second time is never in the pristine, unexamined state a first examiner works with, and that it's not unusual for an outside pathologist to lack access to the original examiner's findings. Crump, reading from the report, said Mitchell could not rule out that some non-accidental factor contributed to Nolan's death. It wasn't a conclusion. It was an open door. 3 days later, on July 22nd, Crump held a second, more detailed press conference, this time in front of a packed room at the WLOX National Convention in Chicago. Reading further from Mitchell's report, he revealed one specific, striking finding: a focal area of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head, in the occipital region. Mitchell's report described the area as relatively large and said the cause of the discoloration could not be determined. Mitchell's report also listed several outstanding questions that remained unanswered, including how Nolan came to enter the water, whether there was water in his airway, and whether he may have had a brain bleed. Crump described Nolan's condition in the moments before he entered the water as the crux of the matter. Crump called the finding significant. He said the family had more questions than answers. He pressed Mississippi authorities to share the state's own findings and photographs with Mitchell, so the case could move forward, and he noted that the state's more invasive autopsy process, which involves removing and dissecting each organ individually, had made it impossible for Mitchell to directly observe Nolan's lungs for water intake or examine the contents of his stomach. Not every forensic expert agreed on how significant that finding actually was. Dr. Michael Baden, a well-known forensic pathologist who reviewed the report for Fox News, said the discoloration described sounded consistent with a superficial impact, the kind of bump someone might get from debris in open water, and that it could have occurred before or after death. Baden said the finding didn't point to foul play and was consistent with an accidental drowning, adding that he felt Mitchell was reaching for conclusions the evidence didn't support. That split, one respected pathologist calling a finding significant and worth investigating, another calling it inconclusive and unremarkable, is a pattern you'll see throughout this case. Two credentialed experts, looking at the same limited evidence, reaching different conclusions. It's not a scandal. It's what happens when a body has already been through one autopsy, sat through weeks of decomposition, and is missing key structures by the time a second doctor gets access to it. But it's also exactly the kind of ambiguity a case like this cannot afford, because ambiguity left alone in public for weeks doesn't stay neutral. People fill it in with their own conclusions, and, as it turned out, some people were willing to manufacture conclusions outright. By the time of that NOC press conference, Nolan Wells' name was no longer just a local story out of coastal Mississippi. It had become a national one, and race was a central part of why. Nolan has been widely described as the only black member of his friend group on that trip, a detail that circulated in photos from the day, though it has not been independently confirmed with full certainty. Still, it's the framing that took hold, and it's the framing that pulled in some of the country's most prominent voices. The Reverend Al Sharpton personally helped escort Nolan's parents at a memorial service held in their honor at a church in Ocean Springs on July 20th. ESPN commentator Stephen A. Smith weighed in publicly as well, telling News Nation host Chris Cuomo that the case felt highly suspicious to him, and that it resonates particularly within the black community. A young black man, the only one in his group, the only one who didn't come home. After Nolan's funeral, Smith posted publicly that the case wasn't over, and that people needed to find out what happened to him. That national spotlight cuts both ways. It's brought resources, attention, and pressure on investigators to move faster and communicate more. It's also brought exactly the kind of high-stakes, high-emotion environment where misinformation thrives. Because when millions of people are emotionally invested in a case and starving for concrete facts, fabricated content promising exactly that becomes almost impossible to resist sharing. The grief around Nolan's death didn't wait for a funeral date. Tashema Hands, whose son Javon Williams was one of Nolan's close friends and had originally been expected to make the Horn Island trip himself, spoke publicly in the days after Nolan's body was found about the toll it had taken on her son and his friends. A group of kids who had grown up in and out of each other's houses, suddenly forced to process losing one of their own in the most public, most scrutinized way imaginable. It was Tashema who Christine Wansley called that first night, trying to piece together where Nolan might be, before either family had any idea how the next several weeks would unfold. That detail matters because it's easy, watching this story from the outside through press conferences and press releases, to lose sight of the fact that this began as a group of real teenagers and young adults on a holiday trip, most of whom have spent the weeks since fielding questions from investigators, reporters, and strangers online, all while genuinely grieving a friend. The United Cajun Navy's investigative report, later obtained by TMZ, included a photograph showing 3 separate boats from Nolan's broader friend group anchored off Horn Island that afternoon. A small human detail that underscores just how many people were present and how many separate, incomplete perspectives investigators have had to try to stitch together into one coherent timeline. On July 20th, hundreds gathered at Center Point Church in Ocean Springs to say goodbye to Nolan. Mourners lined up hours before the service began, many of them wearing black and blue, his high school team's colors, at the family's request. His head coach at Ocean Springs High, Jake Bramlett, told NBC News that Nolan had been a great young man to coach, someone the current players had been brought up under, in Bramlett's words, learning from him how to carry themselves both on the field and off it. Bramlett also noted that teammates had rallied around Nolan's younger siblings, who still play for the same program. Christine Wansley spoke at the service, thanking God for what she called the beautiful 18 years she and Elmore had with their son, and telling the crowd their hearts were broken but at peace, knowing where he now rested. Filmmaker Spike Lee and NFL veteran Terrell Owens were among those in attendance. Actor and director Tyler Perry covered the cost of the funeral services. Following the service, Crump, Sharpton, and Nolan's parents held a press conference, where Crump reiterated the family's central demand that if investigators wanted to examine Nolan's phone, the same scrutiny should apply to the phones of everyone who was with him on the island that day. At that same event, Sharpton announced a $50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction in the case. It's worth pausing on that reward for a second, because it tells you something important about where things stood a full 2 weeks after Nolan's body was found. Nobody, at that point, had been arrested, charged, or even publicly named as a person of interest. The reward wasn't confirmation of a crime. It was an acknowledgement that, weeks in, the case remained exactly what officials had always said it was: open, unresolved, and still without an official cause of death. Here's what a lot of people following this story only loosely don't realize. The viral toxicology report isn't the first piece of fabricated evidence to attach itself to this case. It's not even the first one aimed at a specific person. Remember the Ceto call, the one placed when a friend's boat started taking on water near Horn Island. A version of that audio began circulating online, digitally enhanced, paired with a written transcript that claimed to reveal names spoken in the background, including what some listeners insisted was the name Bart, a reference to Bart Edmiston Jr., a former high school teammate of Nolan's, who had been on the island that day and helped the distressed boat by boarding it, removing a drain plug, and towing it briefly so the water could clear. Edmiston, by every account from his family and his attorney, cooperated fully and voluntarily with investigators from the very beginning, sitting for interviews, handing over his phone, his GPS data, and his boat for inspection, without a lawyer, without a warrant, and without hesitation. He has never been publicly identified by investigators as a suspect in this case. None of that stopped the enhanced audio and transcript from spreading. Attorney Russell Latino, who represents Edmiston, said publicly that he believed the widely shared version of the recording had no legitimacy, that it combined doctored audio with a fabricated transcript, designed to make listeners believe they were hearing words that simply weren't there in the original, garbled recording. Online speculation built on top of that fake transcript, combined with an unrelated old photo, spiraled into public accusations that Edmiston was somehow involved in Nolan's death. His address, photographs of his home, and information about his family were posted online. He received what his attorney described as a credible death threat, serious enough that the FBI and state and local law enforcement were notified. Around the same time, federal authorities separately arrested a California man accused of sending death threats to the Mississippi judge connected to the case. Edmiston's family eventually broke their public silence, saying the targeted attacks on their son made staying quiet impossible. Their statement was direct. He did not kill a friend, witness the death of a friend, or conceal the death of a friend, and that the claims being spread about him were, in their words, fictions made up by people with no actual knowledge of what happened that day. Latino began issuing formal cease and desist letters to accounts, spreading the claims, and the family has said they're prepared to pursue defamation litigation. Sit with that for a second. A doctored piece of audio, paired with an invented transcript, was enough to put a real, named 18-year-old, someone who had voluntarily cooperated with every investigator who asked, into an online narrative where strangers were treating him as a murder suspect and threatening his life. That happened weeks before the fake toxicology report ever surfaced. It's not a footnote to this story. It's the preview. Here's where the information vacuum becomes structural, not just circumstantial. On July 23, Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath confirmed that the state's official autopsy findings, completed by that point but never made public, would not be released. Instead, they'd go directly to a grand jury. For anyone unfamiliar with how that works, a grand jury isn't a trial, and it isn't open to the public. It's a panel of ordinary citizens convened, in this kind of case, to review the evidence investigators have gathered and decide whether it supports moving forward with formal charges against someone. Because grand jury proceedings are private by law in nearly every U.S. jurisdiction, prosecutors are generally barred from publicly discussing the specific evidence being presented until and unless that evidence becomes part of a public court proceeding. That's not unique to this case. It's baked into how the American legal system tries to prevent evidence from being tainted, witnesses from being influenced, or someone's reputation from being publicly destroyed before a formal determination has even been made. McIlrath explained her reasoning in a public statement, saying every death in the county, other than those from natural causes or non-criminal car accidents, is presented to a grand jury as a matter of standing office practice, not as a special measure invented for this case. She said Mississippi's rules of professional conduct restrict what a prosecutor can say publicly during an active investigation, and that her silence isn't an attempt to keep the truth from the public. It's an effort to protect the integrity of the investigation and the fairness of the eventual grand jury proceeding. Her office has said that obligation extends to the investigating agencies working the case too, requiring them to exercise the same restraint. For anyone unfamiliar with what happens after a grand jury actually convenes, the panel reviews the evidence prosecutors present and decides whether it's sufficient to formally indict someone, meaning the case would proceed toward criminal charges, or whether it declines to indict, sometimes called returning no bill, meaning the evidence as presented didn't meet the legal threshold to move forward. Either outcome is a real, legitimate result of the process. A grand jury declining to indict isn't automatically evidence of a cover-up, just as an indictment isn't automatic proof of guilt. It simply means the review has concluded and a formal decision has been reached, at which point at least some of the evidence typically becomes part of the public record for the first time. Right now, Nolan's case hasn't reached that stage. The evidence is still being assembled and presented, which is precisely why nothing concrete, including toxicology, has been made public yet. By the end of July, officials confirmed the state's full autopsy was complete. Its results, including any toxicology findings, were headed to the grand jury, not to the public. Crump's team, meanwhile, said they were in ongoing talks with the DA's office about a possible joint review of evidence, including phones connected to the case, led on the family's side by attorney Eric Hertz, with Crump's team saying they believed the FBI could also be involved in that process. So by early August, here's where the actual verified case stood. An independent, family-commissioned autopsy calling cause and manner of death undetermined. A completed state autopsy whose findings, including toxicology, had not been shared with the family's pathologist, or the public. A district attorney legally and ethically bound not to discuss evidence before a grand jury. And a separate, private investigative report commissioned by the United Cajun Navy, the volunteer organization that had assisted in the original search, which reviewed photographs, video, GPS coordinates, and witness accounts, and concluded that a material gap still exists in the timeline between the last independently corroborated sighting of Nolan and the reported departure of the boat that had carried him to the island. That 22-page report, according to the organization's vice president Brian Trasher, was shared with Nolan's family, with prosecutors, and with law enforcement. It explicitly stated that it reached no conclusion about criminal or civil responsibility, only that specific, identifiable gaps in the evidence remained unresolved. In other words, nobody outside a small circle of investigators, attorneys, and the grand jury itself actually knows what the state's toxicology results say. Not the public, not, as far as has been reported, even Nolan's own family. That is the environment a fake toxicology document dropped into. An environment that had already produced one fabricated piece of evidence targeting an innocent friend, weeks earlier, with real-world, dangerous consequences. In the final days of July and the first days of August, a new document began circulating across social media, formatted to look like an official toxicology report bearing Nolan Wells' name. It moved the way this kind of content always moves, screenshotted, reposted, dropped into group chats and comment sections, stripped of its original source with every share, until by the time most people saw it, there was no way to trace where it had come from or verify anything about it. People argued over what it meant. Some treated it as confirmation of a theory they already believed. Others treated it as proof the family's concerns had been overblown. Attorney Russell Latino, the same attorney representing Bart Edmiston, and by this point intimately familiar with how fast fabricated content could spread in this case, said publicly that some of the fake toxicology documents circulating looked extremely convincing, realistic enough that people without direct knowledge of the case had no real way to tell they weren't genuine. And that's really the core of the problem. The document didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to look official enough and land in an environment hungry enough for answers to spread before anyone could stop and ask the obvious question. On August 1st, Sean Tyndall, Commissioner of the Mississippi Department of Public Safety, addressed the document directly in a public statement. His words were blunt. The purported toxicology report circulating through social media, he said, is fraudulent. He added that Nolan's family, his friends, and Nolan himself deserved better than to have his death turned into viral content by people chasing clicks and shares. Tyndall pointed to what he described as a toxic mix behind documents like this one. Fraudsters, artificial intelligence tools capable of generating convincing fake documents, and a social media ecosystem that rewards whoever shares first, whether or not what they're sharing is true. His advice to the public was simple: don't click it and don't share it. Latino echoed the warning from the family's side, drawing a direct line back to what had already happened to his own client weeks earlier. He said flatly that someone's death should not be treated as entertainment, and told the public, in his own words, to touch grass and step back from the speculation. So the answer to the question we opened with is now clear. The document that's been circulating, the one people have been treating as a smoking gun in one direction or the other, it's not real. It was never verified by anyone with actual access to Nolan Wells' case. According to the state's own top public safety official, it's a fabrication, quite possibly generated with the same kind of AI tools that can now produce a convincing government document in minutes. Here's the part that tends to catch people off guard. There isn't a public answer to that question. Not yet. The state's official autopsy, which would include any real toxicology findings, has been completed for weeks now. But per the district attorney's office, those results are sealed, headed to a grand jury, not to reporters, not to social media, and not, as far as the public record shows, to Nolan's own family or their independent pathologist. Dr. Mitchell, who performed the family's independent autopsy, has said he believes the proper venue to interpret any toxicology findings would be in front of that same grand jury, once the state actually shares them. Which means every single claim you've seen online about what was or wasn't found in Nolan Wells' system, whatever platform it came from, however official it looked, has been either speculation, fabrication, or both. Nobody posting screenshots on social media has had legitimate access to results that, by every official account, haven't been released to anyone outside a tightly controlled legal process. It's worth sitting with why this happened twice, because it's not really about one fake document, or even two. It's about what happens to any high-profile, emotionally charged case when official information moves slower than public demand for it. Mississippi's legal process here isn't unusual. Prosecutors regularly withhold evidence ahead of grand jury proceedings, precisely because premature disclosure can taint witnesses, compromise a case, or unfairly damage reputations before all the facts are in. Which is exactly what happened to Bart Edmiston when a fabricated transcript did the damage a real disclosure process is specifically designed to prevent. The district attorney's justification for her silence isn't a talking point invented for this case. It reflects standard practice in death investigations in her jurisdiction. But standard legal process and public patience move on two completely different clocks. One is measured in the careful, procedural pace of a grand jury. The other is measured in minutes, refreshes, and whatever spreads fastest in a comment section. Into that gap between the two clocks, someone dropped a fake audio recording targeting an innocent friend. And a few weeks later, someone dropped a fake toxicology report claiming to reveal the one piece of information every single person following this case wants most. Both were built to look official. Both offered something nobody with actual authority over the case was offering: a definitive answer. And for a while, both worked, because they landed in a space the real investigation, by design and by law, had not yet been able to fill. There isn't an ending yet, not from investigators, not from the grand jury, not from anyone with actual authority over this case. As it stands, Nolan Wells' cause and manner of death remain officially undetermined. The state's completed autopsy, including any toxicology findings, sits with prosecutors, waiting to go before a Jackson County grand jury. The family's independent autopsy, conducted by Dr. Roger Mitchell, also returned an undetermined result, hampered by decomposition and by not having access to organs and tissue the state retained. The private analytical review commissioned by the United Cajun Navy found a gap in the timeline that still hasn't been closed. Attorneys for the family continue to press for access to evidence, including a possible joint review of phones connected to the case. Bart Edmiston Jr.'s legal team continues to pursue accountability for the false claims and threats made against him. And officials continue to warn the public that any document or recording claiming to reveal real, unreleased evidence, no matter how convincing it looks or sounds, should be treated as false unless it comes directly and verifiably from investigators. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He was days away from starting a football season he never got to play. His parents have said, again and again, that all they want is the truth, not speed, not speculation, just the truth, whenever the process is finally ready to deliver it. Until that happens, the most honest thing anyone covering this case can tell you is also the least satisfying one. We don't know yet. Anyone who tells you otherwise, Anyone waving around a document or a recording that nobody official has confirmed is asking you to trust them over the people who actually have access to the facts. In this case, that instinct to trust the loudest, most official-looking version of events has already put a real, innocent young man's life at risk once. It's worth remembering that the next time something claiming to be leaked shows up in your feed, it's not a coincidence that Nolan Wells' case, specifically, has now produced 2 separate pieces of fabricated content in the span of a few weeks. 3 ingredients make a case like this unusually fertile ground for exactly this kind of fraud. First, there's genuine, sustained public attention. Millions of people across multiple platforms actively following every update, which means anything purporting to be new information starts with a built-in audience primed to share it instantly. Second, there's a real and acknowledged information gap. Officials have been consistent and public about withholding evidence pending the grand jury, which means the public knows there is real, existing information out there that simply hasn't been released, making the idea of a leak inherently plausible rather than far-fetched. And third, there's emotional and social stakes high enough that people feel compelled to act, to share, to comment, to take a side, the moment they see something that appears to confirm what they already believe about the case, whether that's suspicion of a cover-up or suspicion of the family's account. Take any one of those 3 ingredients away, and fabricated content struggles to spread. Take away public attention, and nobody's watching closely enough to manufacture something convincing. Take away the real information gap, and there's nothing plausible to fake, because everything's already public. Take away the emotional stakes, and people pause to verify before sharing rather than reacting on instinct. Nolan Wells' case has all 3, in abundance, which is exactly why it's now happened twice. It's worth stepping back for a moment and understanding why fabricated content like this works so well in the first place. Because this case is far from the only one where it's happened, and it won't be the last. Modern document generation and image tools have made it trivial to produce something that mimics an official letterhead, an agency seal, or the formatting conventions of a real government or medical form. It doesn't take specialized skill or expensive software anymore. It takes a template, a name, and a few minutes. Once that document exists, its spread has almost nothing to do with whether it's true, and almost everything to do with whether it's emotionally compelling and whether it confirms something people already suspect. A screenshot doesn't carry a watermark proving where it came from. Once it's been reposted a dozen times, cropped a dozen different ways, there's no byline, no publication, and no editor attached to it. Just a claim, floating free of any accountability. Officials investigating Nolan Wells' case pointed to exactly this dynamic when they addressed the fake toxicology report, describing a combination of bad actors deliberately fabricating content, artificial intelligence tools capable of producing convincing fakes at scale, and a social media environment that rewards speed over accuracy. None of that is unique to this case. It's the same basic pattern behind fake court documents, fake medical records, and fake official statements that have surfaced in dozens of other high-profile news stories in recent years. What makes it dangerous here isn't that it's a new trick. It's that it worked on a case where real people, a grieving family, a wrongly accused friend, an entire community demanding accountability, were already at their most emotionally raw and least equipped to slow down and verify before sharing. A few habits genuinely help. Before sharing anything described as leaked results, a confirmed report, or an obtained document in a case like this, it's worth asking a simple question. Has this actually been confirmed by name, on the record, by an official source, a police department, a district attorney's office, a named attorney, a credentialed reporter citing a specific document they've reviewed? Or is it just a screenshot with no traceable origin? If nobody with an actual name and an actual position is willing to put their credibility behind a claim, that claim doesn't deserve yours either. If this case has affected you, if you're following it because it hits close to home, or because you simply want to see Nolan's family get real answers, The most useful thing you can do right now isn't sharing unverified documents or recordings.
It's staying skeptical of anything claiming to be leaked results, checking whether a claim has actually been confirmed by the District Attorney's Office, the Mississippi Department of Public Safety, or the family's own legal team before you pass it along, and pausing before you assign blame to any specific person based on content you can't verify. If you want to stay updated as this case moves through the grand jury process, subscribe to this channel. We'll keep following it as verified information comes out, and only as verified information comes out. A final note before you go. Everything in this video reflects publicly reported statements from Mississippi state officials, the Jackson County District Attorney's Office, attorneys for the Wells family, attorneys for other individuals named in this case, and independent forensic experts, current as of early August 2026. The toxicology document referenced in this video has been publicly identified as fake by the Mississippi Department of Public Safety. The enhanced CTO audio and transcript referenced in this video have been publicly disputed as doctored by the attorney representing the individual it targeted, who has not been named a suspect by investigators. No official toxicology results in the death of Nolan Wells have been released to the public as of this recording. Cause and manner of death remain undetermined, and the investigation remains active. This video does not allege wrongdoing by any individual, and nothing here should be treated as confirmed fact beyond what has been officially released. For the latest verified updates, refer directly to official statements from Mississippi state authorities and the Jackson County District Attorney's Office.